Hello, Vanderbloemen team. Yvette asked me to send over a summary of how sermon mapping might be a great tool to help you profile and place senior pastors. So I'm recording a short overview of it right now. I'm Ryan Hall, senior pastor of a church planted 15 years ago in Chicago. And I'm also on the SBC Send Network preaching assessment team. So the SBC, we screen 400 to 800 church planners a year in the country, and I'm on the Chicago team, so I help to profile and assess preachers in Chicago. So I do some of those preachers. And so I developed a tool that is designed to help get an objective read on the sermon of preachers. We know how important it is to find effective preachers. Carrie Nieuwhof just posted that 86% of people choose a church based on the quality of the preaching. So that is one important trait to assess correctly. Sermon mapping is the best tool out there to assess and profile preachers. So what is it? Let me share with you a little overview of sermon mapping here. All right. So here is a sermon map. And the way it works is there's about 50 things a preacher can do. They're all listed over here on the left. And the orange lane is explaining the text. The green lane is illustrating it. The blue lane is applying the text. And then there's some presentation down here. So anytime the preacher does anything, you put a dot and then you connect the dots. It flows through time. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 minutes. Their main points are up here at the top. And when you go through the sermon and you map it out, you get what's like an EKG of the sermon, and then it shows you everything they did. So here's a completed map of Chuck Swindoll preaching 1 John 5, 1-5. I can tell you everything he did. Gave some general commentary, did an author profile, background context info, shared a little cultural observation, came back up, another author profile, shared a quote. I can tell you everything he did to explain, illustrate, and apply the text. And the map shows his style. He, of course, loves to explain the text. I mean, he authored a systematic theology textbook, but he also, Chuck Swindoll, loves to share those heartwarming stories and illustrations. It's what he's known for. Now, what if I mapped John MacArthur preaching the exact same passage, 1 John 5, 1-5? Well, you can see how his style shows on the sermon map. He is a world-class expositor. And just within the first 4 to 6 minutes, he gives us 26 different phrases that apply to the church, of course, because he's John MacArthur. And look at the precision. We can see how precisely he explains the text. His structure emerges up here. So you can already see, reading a sermon map, how the profile of the preacher shows up. This is John Piper preaching the exact same passage, 1 John 5, 1-5. You haven't even heard him preach this sermon, yet because of the sermon map, you can see his style, his emphasis. You can see his structure, point 1, point 2, point 3. And you can make an assessment on how he preaches, where he goes. And based on the text, you can check to make sure he hits all the main ideas. Here's Tony Evans preaching the exact same passage. You see his emphasis is more down here in application, but he doesn't skip explanation or illustration. And these are world-renowned preachers. 4 preachers, same passage, and based on the sermon map, like an EKG for the sermon, I could tell you exactly what they did, what makes them special, and what kind of preacher they are. Now, the sermon map can also be used to assess a client. And so here, this is a real assessment from an SBC church planting assessment that I helped with. So this guy, Josue, I was responsible for giving him some feedback, and these are pass-fail assessments. So knowing that he's going to cut it as a preacher is very important. So this is a Sermon Map Pro analysis for him, and you can see based on his map that he stuck primarily in the explanation lane, got a little bit into illustration and application. He was preaching from 2 Corinthians 3, 1-6. And so from this sermon map, when it's all done, you can put together a pro analysis of his outline, his explanation. Those were pretty good. Illustration and application, he didn't give us a ton, but he gave us some, so those were kind of okay. Delivery was really good. And then we talked through some key indicators, key metrics: mind, heart, will, soul. What does he primarily emphasize or appeal to? Did really well when it came to reasoning through the text, challenging our mind, teaching us the heart. Emotions, not so much on the will or the soul, spiritual formation or calls to action in this sermon. And then what kind of a communicator is he? Emotional, fast, friendly, loud, intellectual, slow, formal, quiet. These dots kind of give you just a really quick read, a fast read on what kind of a communicator he was. A little more emotional, a little more friendly, kind of slow, a little bit quiet. And then this is the full rundown where we give a profile and assessment of him. And so there's obviously a lot here, but this is an example of how you could get a professional analysis of a preacher from a sermon map. Now, what about David Hernandez? He preached from Genesis 1:1-4. This would be an example of some red, yellow flags kind of coming up. He had a lot of movement in his sermon, you can see, and he hit a lot of really great things, especially helping us to apply the text, but there were some problems. His outline and his explanation did not line up with the passage. He really didn't preach Genesis 1:1-4. He launched out of that into a topical message about something very different. And so his illustrations, his applications, all of it raised some pretty significant flags of his preaching ability. Delivery was great. He's a great communicator. And so we can, continue to go through the profile. But really, he's already kind of indicated there's some concerns about his sermon. And so then in the analysis here, we would say that we observed several yellow, red flags in his communication. We recommend a deeper analysis of David's preaching to get a better understanding of his patterns of communication, meaning we got to map at least 1, 2, 3 other sermons to figure out, is this a pattern in his preaching? Now, great news for David. Once we did go through another sermon, he actually checked out. That sermon was a fluke fail. He was in a weird context, and he actually is a really solid preacher who just had a dud that was super concerning. So it's really good that we went through and did a deeper dive. All right, and just for fun, this is Alistair Begg. So imagine if Alistair Begg came to your organization and wanted to find a position, right? Here's a sermon of Alistair Begg. Obviously, he explains the text. He illustrates the text. He applies it. This was from 1 Peter 5, cast all your cares on the Lord. Every single thing he does shows up on the map. And yes, he is all green. It was a wonderful sermon, start to finish, outline, explanation, illustration, application, delivery. He touched the heart. He shaped the mind. He challenged the will. He called us to spiritual formation with the soul. He shows up a little bit more intellectual, slower, very friendly, not super loud or quiet. And when you read through his candidate profile assessment, of course it says at the end, Alistair is a unicorn, a rare gem. He could rise to serve at the highest level of effectiveness as a preacher. So I just took you through what a sermon map pro analysis looks like when it comes to a candidate who's good, with strengths and weaknesses, a candidate who's alarming and needs a deeper dive, and a candidate who is a true diamond, who's heading to really great places. So just like you use the DISC profile to get an objective read on a candidate, or maybe Strengths Finder, their leadership, their personality style, you could use sermon mapping to receive an expert profile of their preaching. Now, I know you're already doing an assessment for their preaching, and here's the thing. Whatever else you're already doing, the sermons you're watching, the rubrics you're filling out, would be enhanced by also getting a sermon map done. Because you can tie your insights into a professional analysis that creates a comprehensive picture of the preacher. Sermon mapping adds to whatever you're doing and makes it even better. If you want to try sermon mapping on some of your candidates, you could screen out problem preachers quickly who would alarm your clients. I mean, if you spend, for some of these candidates, a week looking into their social media behavior, wouldn't it be nice to give your clients the reassurance that you've also done a preaching check in addition to the sermons they've sent in, maybe 2, 3 others? That would be great assurance. You could create, with sermon mapping, better matches between preachers and compatible congregations. So my nephew just got married last week. We went to rural Minnesota to a wedding, and I love my nephew, great guy. I was hoping he matched with a great gal. I didn't know her that well. So we got there, the wedding was awesome, and it was obvious to everyone that they were ridiculously compatible. I mean, their families, their love, that they were ridiculously compatible. Now, I know that's what you want for your churches and your candidates. You want them to be ridiculously compatible, and they have to be compatible with what they expect from a preacher and what the preacher is actually able to deliver. And I think if you want to try out sermon mapping, I think you could identify those unicorn preachers who really rise to the top 10% or even 1% of communication. I would imagine your high-end clients really want great assurance that they are getting an elite communicator who stands out. And you would want to be able to demonstrate to them objectively what it is that makes this pastor truly special. Well, sermon mapping can be one way that you can help them with that. So I'd love to discuss this tool more with you, and I appreciate you checking this out. So hopefully I'll talk to you again soon. God bless.